Okay. Well, we have some attendees. We have our speakers. So I think we can confidently start our conversation. Welcome, everyone. This is the first conversation of a series of conversations that we'll be hosting throughout the year in 2024. And we're calling it Echo Effect, Conversations on War and Environment. And this first one, it's explorations on art science from urgency to possibility. And today I'm Ines Montalvao. I'm the program director at Artists with Evidence that I will share briefly about. And with me today, I have Akbar Mehta next to me, so in person. And we have Colin Greer joining us from New York in the United States. And we also have here, you will see Mathilde. Maybe you can say hello, just wave at people. So this is Mathilde. She's also helping us with the production and communications of this whole series. So yeah, to start off, I will introduce a bit of myself and Artists with Evidence. Who are we and what are we doing these days? So my name is Ines Montalvao. I'm a multidisciplinary creative. I've worked mostly with exhibitions, science centers, science museums. And last May, I started also working with Artists with Evidence as program director. I still develop my art science practice. So this is now what I'm doing. And Artists with Evidence, who are we? We have also some members and a couple of members of the board also joining us in the chat today. Artists with Evidence is an organization that is interested in fostering dialogue between art and science, and therefore engaging people that are working on both areas, but also on the crossroads of this area. So we have a lot of people that are also working with art and science combined. Before we start, it would be great to have a couple of words from Colin and Ali about themselves. Just introduce yourselves briefly. We'll have also time to go into more detail about your collaborations. So,
sure. Colin, would you like to go first?
No, you go first.
Oh, okay. All right. So, hello, everybody. I'm Ali Akbar Mehta. I'm a transmedia artist, curator, and a researcher, currently doing my doctoral research at Aalto University. My practice has been to create immersive interactive archives, often online, but also offline, that operate on the intersections of art, science, and technology, also orbiting themes of violence, conflict, and trauma. These are the core thematic frameworks of my work. I think for me, since the beginning of my practice, it has been very important to engage with these kind of subjects, which can be heavy for a lot of people. But I think that for me, what is really important is that through this, gaining a sense of understanding and knowing the world differently, and to also understand it anew, to unlearn and reconfigure one's worldview on a constant basis. So a lot of the archival work that I do is not looking at investigating or extracting from existing archives, but on the other hand, creating new archival logics, new archival rules, as a way to also depart from the history of archiving, the history of institutional and legacy archiving, what I like to call it, which have strong roots in coloniality. So also think about then how can archiving form a decolonial practice? How can the tools of internet and online technologies provide free, open source, decolonial, and politically conscious archives for the future?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's
Yeah.
it.
In a nutshell. And
In
Colin.
a nutshell, to be examined closely in the course of our conversations. Yeah, I'm Colin Greer. I'm in New York City, originally from London, England. I'm a writer. I write poetry and plays. I also direct a foundation in the United States. I used to teach at the university. I taught history and political science. I've directed this foundation for quite some time, and over time we have created an institution that is run by the people to whom we make grants. The board is made up of recipients and either past or current or future recipients. We operate from a ground up point of view. We fund only activism on the ground. We don't fund public policy. We don't fund think tanks. We don't fund universities. We fund people in action. That includes political action and the action of the arts. All of that, which I've done for a number of years, has always felt like I was moving in a direction of a new enlightenment, that we were actually building a society in which people would be decolonized and liberated. And it feels like now that that's all being threatened seriously by a new kind of zeitgeist. And that's to be challenged, and war and environment are summaries of that problem. And when Ines said I was in the United States, I thought to myself, yeah, I'm in the disunited States, at the heart of a very chaotic world. And I have 8 grandchildren, and I feel very responsible for them.
8, yes. Yeah, and also one thing to mention is that Colin is also a member of the board at AWE, so Artists with Evidence. And so it's also someone that can speak from the heart why AWE came to be and why we're looking into art science to fight this zeitgeist, like you're saying. So the world that we're in at the moment, and what kind of questions are arising. And that's why we wanted to focus this also on war and environment, because it's like one of the issues of our times. But before we go into like this matters, which there's so much to explore, I must say that I've had a lot of conversations online already with Ali and Colin, and they've been so incredible that that's how kind of also the idea came to be, that we could share this with more people and that people could engage regardless of where they are geographically and and in their positionings in life. But I think it's important to start off with art science, because we want to talk about art science, but there is many different levels and understandings of what art science can be or is. And we want to be very clear on where we're positioning ourselves. So we don't want to talk about, when people say that art is using science for, or science is using art for communicating or as a decoration or something like that. So we really want to focus on how these are ways of producing knowledge and how they are so rooted in creativity, both and together. And I think that, Colin, if you want to add something to that and kind of why Artists with Evidence came to be in that sense, and why we value so much this notion of art-science in a way, and not putting them in opposite poles or something that kind of can use each other, but more of something that has its root together in creativity and both produce knowledge.
Yeah, sure. I won't say much about how it came to be. I'll say a little. It came to be because of 2 people with a lot of energy. Adam Law, who is a doctor and scientist, and Scott Johnson, who's an architect and composer, came together and through their energy put this project into practice and brought partners on, and I was fortunate to be invited to join. But with respect to art and science, let me just say a few things, and then perhaps Ali would amplify. There are two or three things that they're always on my mind when I think about those two fields conjoined. First of all, what we're engaged in at AW is an epistemological collaboration. It's an effort to understand how knowledge is created mutually and separately. What always comes to mind when I think about it is the wonderful line from Shakespeare's Richard II, I believe, in which he says, "The eye cannot see itself seeing." The eye cannot see itself seeing. So we see ourselves and our world through reflection and through distortion. And the work of both science and art is to correct for the distortion. And we engage in that process in order to, at the very best of our intentions, create a more humane and peaceful world. There are people who are happy to live or content to live with the distortion and think of it as reality. And when they embrace the distortion, we get what I regard as the problems of our world, and our job is to engage that, but to respectfully understand that they operate with a mysterium the way we do. We have a mysterium based on the belief that humans can be more humane, and the embrace of the distortion has a mysterium based on the idea that we are bestial and can do no better than live with coercion and battle.
Yeah.
So that for me is the kind of the key framework. Would you want to add anything to that, Ali?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's thank you for that great opening. I think the line of "the eye cannot see itself seeing" is fantastic. And to that effect, maybe just to kind of say that the idea of art and science as two separate entities is also such a recent phenomena. I mean, if we also just investigate the timeline of knowledges, art and science were not separate entities. I mean, just look something as recently as the Renaissance, for example, with Michelangelo's work or Leonardo da Vinci's work, draftsmanship and the act of drawing was actually considered a scientific genre, at par with mathematics, at par with astronomy and cosmology. And in a way, if one looks at art and science as two umbrella fields that are in service to the idea of knowing, then the question that one needs to ask is that what then makes them separate? And traditionally, or at least in the last 50, 60 years, there has been a cementing of this idea that science is exact and art is inexact or fluid or somehow a bit more permeable and osmotic. And the thing is that, especially when working within these intersections of art and science, one realizes very quickly that scientific principles lost the claim to certainty. At least 60 years ago, before Einstein already, we were talking about science as a system of probabilities rather than exactitude. And probability and uncertainty, in a way, is also what brings it closer to artistic practice, but also in a time where artistic practice, through its modes of artistic research and entering into academic spaces, is trying to actually emulate methodologies of scientific practice and scientific modes of learning. We are now at a convergence moment, and that is what I think what art science we're talking about and what makes it interesting.
Yeah, and that brings me to a topic that I wanted to address with the both of you, which is this uncertainty of science, and this that you mentioned too. And this uncertainty is nowadays being used a lot with denialist agendas, for example, like the tobacco industry, or we can go into the fossil fuel industries. So this uncertainty in science that is inherent to science is also being used as an argument against it and in favor of like and allowing for this denialism to flourish. So kind of how do you see the in a way art science is combating denialism, and how do you see this, you know, like also within your practices and what you see around, like how can denialism then be this tool against democracies, or as Colin would say,
The democratic experiment.
exactly.
Can I say something about that? Is it all right for me to go ahead, Molly?
Please, of course.
Yeah, so I think that, I just want to remind everybody that while what you described, roughly pre-Einstein, is absolutely accurate, there is also the Inquisition, and there is fascism. Those are all systems of eradicating challenges to status quo and systemic privilege. And denialism is in fact a shorthand for power and privilege. And it rests on an article of bad faith, which is that they would deny those facts that challenge, or those hypotheses that challenge power. They're not willing to give up on longevity or electricity or guns or cars. Those are all functions of science. On a day-to-day basis, living is in fact motored, so to speak, by science. And so it's giving up only those questions that actually challenge power. And it's important to understand that when we bring logic to bear, that is denialism as anti-logic, it's always helpful for me to remember Jacques Derrida's point about logic. Logic is in fact rooted in a faith. It's a faith in logic. Logic can't be proven outside of logic. And so it's a faith that logic can hold. And logic is multidimensional. There is logic that is the result of hypothesis and testing. There's logic that comes from the heart that can be captured in presentation of human feeling and human story. And there is the logic that comes from the accretion and protection of power. So, for example, mutual destruction, MAD, mutual guaranteed destruction, is a form of logic, but it's a logic in the interest of power machinery. Debt is a logic that the interest rate should fly through the roof at the cost of human life, is a logic because debt has its own return on investment logic, but it's a logic based on power and privilege. So I think it's important to understand that the so-called right-wing zeitgeist doesn't operate without logic, but it operates with a logic that's defined by the context of power. And the logic of a progressive point of view is a logic based on the hope and possibility of humane, peaceful relations in community.
Yeah. Do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're here for. I will say something for sure. I mean, just thinking also about it from what you just now talked about, Colin, that if one looks at art and science as two lenses through which to look at the world and through which to understand the world, what is reassuring about both art and scientific practices being uncertain to a certain extent, and not fall into the trap of cemented, ossified dogma, is that it has the potentiality for change, for revision, for action, yes, also, but also of, I mean, things that we knew 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 100 years ago have changed. And we are now possibly somewhere around the 700th generation of humanity. And the last most of the changes that have happened, whether social, cultural, scientific, technological, have happened in the last 20 generations or less. So and there's an exponential pace of change, the rate of change actually is continuously growing. So if we cannot actually have um, world systems or systems of thought, systems of understanding the world that are adaptable and open to revision, if they become dogmatic and set in stone, we will be in a lot of problem. And I think this is what we are also looking at in the world today, a return to a certain kind of well, for the lack of a better word, a fundamentalism of thought. It's not a particular, it's not only limited to the right-wing zeitgeist. It is, I think, also seeping into or creeping into a lot of other forms of thinking as well. This desire for or fight against change by remaining the same.
Yep.
And this kind of duality, I mean, I don't want to get into binaries, but the duality between the idea of openness and enclosure, of globalization and location and localization, or macro histories and micro histories of sovereignty and citizenship,
Identity.
security. Exactly. I mean, these are all, we're seeing a rise of these kind of binary modes of thinking as a reaction. Very rightly, I think what you also said in your opening comments, Colin, the reaction to the ways in which we are almost not being able to cope with the pace of change.
Yeah. And this fast pace, it can also bring us to the collaboration
Exactly.
between
And
the two of you, and which is a bit in response, and we will go now into that, like why we're having these conversations and what is echo effect. Echo effect is actually the name that we gave to a collaboration that we are developing with between Ali and Colin, and in which we want to use AI tools. So the idea is that we kind of want to recombine, in a way, part of Ali's work with also Colin's work, and then look at it from a critical point of view. So what are these AI tools we're using? What's the impact on the artwork? What does it mean also in the context of war and environment? Because there's so many levels of in which we can explore the impact that it will have. So yeah, echo effect with the H between parentheses, precisely because it's about echo and the echoes of the past and things that we learn or do not learn from the past, but it's also about ecological effect. So we're looking at this from the war and environment perspective. And this is something that came to be. I can share maybe a bit about the Mathilde will also put it in the chat, but I will share the screen and show the Purgatory archive that maybe Ali could give us. Wait, sorry, gotta.
Maybe just to stop sharing.
Yes. So,
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, so Purgatory Edit is a user-generated montage-based VR experience and cinematic installation. What you're seeing right now is the source material for that, which is the Doom Scroll archive. And it is currently around 30,000 clips that have been sourced from existing archives, specifically war archives, also documentaries, cinema. There's material from maybe
Sorry.
just the audio if we could move to. Okay,
Yeah.
so material from this is open.
Okay.
Okay.
Like this.
So audio from material from panorama B-rolls, the newsreels, so on and so forth. And the idea is actually to create a kind of consolidation of the kind of material that we are subject to on a day-to-day basis. That is part of our cinematic vocabularies, the expanded vocabularies of moving images that we are confronted with on a daily basis. And to then get into a process of a semiotic analysis and research process, which which creates an intensity map and actually is able to categorize this material into a cascading series of intensities and understand the nature of violence and why we understand something to be violent. And this whole research process is actually being done with the help of certain templates and processes that have been developed in the field of peace and conflict research. So we are applying those and working with them. And finally, there is going to be a performance work that will happen.
Yeah, for me, the really interesting part of this, I mean, you can, of course, explore the archive. We will and then have I guess Mathilde put it in the chat already, so you can explore the archive. But for me, the really interesting was this idea of this continuum between violence and peace, and that you cannot understand one without the other.
Right.
And in that sense, also, the interesting thing to combine this with Colin's work. So Colin is a poet, as he said, and there is one poem called When the Smoke Clears that is now being used also for a performance that is in rehearsal that AW is producing. And this poem, we started thinking like, how can this poem, if it's fed in a way, this imagery, like what will we get? And we're still kind of in the early stages of it. There's been a lot of discussion. We need to find right tools, right funding. But then the conversation started amongst the three of us because of this project. And at some point, we had the chance to apply for funding that we got from the Nordic Culture Fund for this series of conversations. And that kind of triggered that the series of conversation is happening before the collaboration, which for us, it's also really interesting because it can kind of influence the topics, the things that we will look into, right?
Yeah, I think when you were introducing the series of conversations, in my mind, I was also thinking, yes, but there's also a component of like a self-serving interest, a component of being greedy that's also at the heart of initiating these conversations, which is essentially that I think that when we, Colin and Ines and I, we've been talking about the ways in which how one can think of collaborating beyond just the parties involved. I think the idea of having a conversation like this is also in order to unpack and open the possibilities of what else can happen through this kind of a process of working together.
Yeah, and in the next conversation, so Ali and Colin and myself will be present in all the conversations in the series. We'll have 6. And in the next 5, we'll have guests joining us. So we'll have more specific topics and we'll be exploring kind of maybe sometimes more surprising topics in relation to war and environment. But I think this, like you were saying, maybe a bit selfishly, but this will feed into this process together. But it's a process that we also want to keep open and transparent. So I don't know if maybe it would be interesting, I don't know, if Colin would maybe want to read a little of his When the Smoke Clears poem.
Sure. Could I just preface it by saying that those images, Ali's images, made me feel like there really is a backdrop to the poem, which is in those images. And let me just say, it's a long poem, so I'm going to excerpt just a little bit, which means it might be a bit jagged, both in terms of text and in my reading of it, but we'll try. So it's called When the Smoke Clears. The sun hangs by a thread in the west. Complacent cumulus stretches across its shoulders, blade to blade, like tripwires attached to dynamite. And the earth is the earth for all that. If they ask why, tell them because glass is smoother than memory. If they ask you when, tell them always, and so it is. If they ask you who, tell them all. Even a bird of little brain is no pushover. If they ask you if, tell them of course. Crawling out of the debris, the pit bull's tongue is the first lick of life after. A later observer will write, about the long sweep of history. Pit bulls are deep down kind, they'll say. Scholars will study the history of canine behavior, and evolution will lead to comparisons like that. And there's the why. Why has evolution not made sapiens kinder? This is the story of change. On the 7th day, it was good. On the 8th day, it wasn't. Fear will do that. We ate dinner at 9, now we eat at 6. Osprey wings cover Hobbes' brutish aria. We get by, my dear. Some way, somehow, we get by. We could hear the prayer in that, like we'd never heard prayer before. Every sapiens needs a trampoline. A little more. Oh, Generalissimo, a word. Who can promise where we might otherwise forage? Why stick a flag in a tub of shining dahlias? Because a young soldier committed suicide? Shy about the weakness in his knees? His acne hardened into a rough fruit? How strongly an element, say a boy playing soldier, interacts with the power of the universe to determine what follows. Generalissimo, those who revile you fear the righteous war you pet for glory, the roses running wild over freshly hallowed ground. Now sapiens is an accessory, loaded with accessories. Greed will not survive the tears. Like a bee in a bottle, soon the buzzing will stop, fragrance forgotten as its dark wings blanket memory. You know the chessmaker will be beaten by the button maker. Civilization is a main stage drama, but only a thought. Generalissimo, imagine your buttons are pinwheels turning in the froth of the air. Remove your hand from up the Earth's ozone skirt. Generalissimo, release the terror in your button-up into bespoke peacefulness. Generalissimo, take your dagger out of the other. Make cutouts of empire, nations, races you've imagined. Generalissimo, blow with the kind of breath a birthday cake full of candles takes to extinguish fire. Generalissimo, when you pick up the pieces, paste the story you found on the calendar on your fridge or on the nearest cave wall where you can rendezvous with fresh imaginings. In the silence, after the smoke. And the earth is the earth for all that. Just listen to the wind blowing smoke, the master language of the earth. No, the wind won't lie down. Yet still there is morning, ready to celebrate the living, to solve for the polyphum of tangled branches, to correct for parables misfired, to celebrate the anniversary of when we began to live together well. After the smoke clears, beyond analysis, just short of despair.
Thank you, Colin. I'm really happy that we can have space for this in a conversation. So that we are not this is a conversation where we are not necessarily making presentations. So we're actually going kind of deep into the topic. We're welcoming any questions also in the Q&A feature. So feel free to write them in, and then we will, towards the end, take a closer look at those. I want to grab one line from the poem, this why has evolution why has evolution not make sapiens kinder? And I want to bring that into also the idea that we have of science and evolution and the role that it's playing right now. We've been talking about so many of this insights that we get, the way we feel in these times. But maybe we could, Matilda will share a poll. We'll use a poll just to try to understand, like in this society right now, where do you believe science plays a more prominent role? So this poll will pop up on your screen, and you can choose one of two choices. So the first one is science enabling structural differences by facilitating war and creating these tools for destruction? Or, in your opinion, right now its most prominent role is in enabling change by trying to understand what are the impacts in environment and society? So you kind of need to make a choice. You can go with both. Not an option. So we can see like how the votes are going. They're like jumping. Some indecision.
I want to.
You want to vote too? What is? You can say it out loud if you don't want it to be secret. Or you can comment on the results.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know how we know if everyone has voted.
We have 19 attending.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
or maybe not everybody.
Yeah, it seems
They
like
have a 63% participation.
that's more than a normal election. So maybe should
we probably at some point should say something, Golly and I, about war and environment, specifically. Just some thoughts. Since people are voting, we could vote by actually making some comment on those themes.
Yes,
Sounds good.
definitely. So maybe we can end the poll, and we got more, well, maybe it's a bit of a hopeful note if we think about it, that if more people are thinking, maybe we can share the poll, the results. So maybe at this point from the people that answered, we got people thinking that science is more towards enabling change and trying to understand what is happening. And so I guess it's a positive note or a hopeful note. Was that your answer?
Yes, I think that would have been my answer eventually.
Eventually, you would be with both. Yeah. Yes, maybe you can stop sharing. I think I need to. Okay.
It's, science and secular thought, sectarian thought has schisms as well as religions. And so it makes sense that those lines are fairly close, because that in fact is the reality. That we are still creating bombs using science and refining them, 2,000-pound bombs on human beings. That's science, sad to say. It's not open-ended inquiry, but it is the application of what was open-ended inquiry. And that's about power and reality. And environment and war put us right in the middle of that complex, I think. Two things I've mentioned to you both before. After World War II, the Bretton Woods agreements created a world that basically indebted decolonizing countries, independent countries, indebted them to Western power. And post-Cold War, post the coming down of the wall, austerity became the principle of indebtedness. And so we've immiserated large parts of the world's population, as we have at the same time denuded the planet of its natural canopy of safety. And that has put people on the move. People are moving away from both war and environmental disaster. And as they move, they encounter a defensiveness, and that leads to the worst end of the continuum of the politics of identity, where we actually exclude rather than include. And I think that the challenge for us as human beings living in societies is to try to make the choice well between inclusion and exclusion, to combat exclusion and to embrace inclusion. There's a cognitive scientist that has a wonderful concept, which is, his name is Libet, that while we may not be able to prove that we have free choice, we can prove that we have free won't, and we can apply our free won't. And we need a politics of free won't. And what we say no to needs to be harnessed with knowledge and heart. And I think that's where we merge art and science, remembering at the same time that we're using art in a very particular way here. We're talking about art as creative product rather than the craft of art making. And science is, in fact, the art of craft making as well. So we have art in the work of science, and we have science in the work of art as we think about human relationships and how people operate on the knowledge they have, and how memory contests history, because shame and blame are more powerful than facts.
Yeah, and it's a good reflection also on this dual nature of science. You know, we have the greatest scientific minds creating the nuclear bomb. So this brings us kind of down to earth in a sense, and it also really puts an edge on what does it mean to win and to lose, and what kind of losses are we talking about, right? When we're talking about in the context of war and environment, like who wins the war and what's the loss. And we can talk about loss from in the environmental aspect, but from a human aspect, a cultural aspect, and all these forced migrations, all these consequences will also have an impact on what's the win lose, quite kind of.
Sure. I mean, I think, maybe just to speak about from a personal position, I think earlier on, maybe a few years ago, I had a bit of a difficulty in reconciling myself to what does it really mean to speak about environmental effects and climate change. Yes, I know that there's an urgency to it, but for me, coming from the kind of background that I'm coming from, and also the life that one is, in a way, living in a place like Helsinki, as an immigrant, as a person of color, etc., 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 certain kinds of issues definitely seem much more urgent and immediate, right? And but the thing is, the fact of the matter is that it's all entangled, and the point is that when we talk about the environment, we yes can talk about the natural environment, but also the human environment, the socio-political environment, the climate of the politics today. These are all entanglements that actually affect one another very, very strongly, to a point where we can't talk about one without talking about the other. And it really reminds me of Audre Lorde's statement, we cannot speak about single issues because we are not living in single issue worlds. And I mean, I really liked, Colin, what you talked about, this idea of wants. And maybe I'd extend it also to needs and rights. And in that sense, I can maybe also talk about what I earlier mentioned, the whole categorization system that one has been looking at for Purgatory Edit, but also in other projects that I've done in the past. The work of Johan Galtung, for example, he defines violence as a negation of need, human basic fundamental needs. So these can be understood as freedom needs, survival needs, well-being needs, identity needs, and ecological needs. So negation of, for example, survival needs in a direct sense is maybe somebody hitting you, assaulting you, murdering you, etc. But on a more structural level, it would mean a form of genocide. And on an ecological level, it would mean ecocide, but also the normalization of the ways in which our lives are being structured through invisible modes of neocolonialism, capitalism, the conversation of debt that you were having, so on and so forth. So these needs and the negation of these needs then actually allow us to understand violence as a kind of a fundamental disintegration. And war is the most acute form of that, in the sense that it is acutely political, it is acutely social, it is both interpersonal but also collective as a form of violence. It has direct level of skills, but it has structural scale and a more cultural scale. Cultural meaning that it is normalized to a point of invisibilization, where we no longer see its effect, its symptomatic effect. We see, of course, the final effect, but so on and so forth. And so, in that sense, war and its ethics, or the normalization of the ethics of war, which then we also see in the ways in which we deal with each other, both interpersonally, but also each other in terms of groups and communities, peoples, ethnicities, genders, different forms of identities, but also the way in which we deal with each other on a more expanded sense of both human, non-human, other than human, post-human beings, can be actually rested on this idea of the normalization of the ethics of war, where the inherent subhumanization actually becomes the way to move forward. And I, I'm just maybe going on a bit too much, but I really wanted to also point out or talk about, because you mentioned, Colin, the state of the world post Second World War, and a kind of system of debt. I was also thinking about the idea of biopolitics, where immediately after the war, and this is a term by Foucault, and he talks about biopolitics as a kind of a orientation towards the welfare, or the government's responsibilities towards the welfare of its people. And Achille Mbembe, from whom the term planetary entanglement is something that I often use and talk about, he is talking about necropolitics, which is the ways in which governments, in being responsible for its own citizens, in a way deal in a necropolitical manner with those who it's not responsible for, those who are not its citizens. But also it can mean, for example, in India, the way in which the right-wing government is choosing to engage with its citizens that it's deeming to be less than or second class, So it's even it kind of gets muddier. It gets a little muddier, but this kind of an orientation of power to think of the welfare for those it chooses to be its own, and those that it says is its other, and where biopolitics is based, or can be summarized as in a single line, as the right to live. Necropolitics, which is the kind of politics that we see today, is the right to let die. And that is exactly what we are seeing in multiple parts of the world, not just through wars, but also more invisible structural forms of oppression and dehumanization, for example.
Can I just add, I think that's absolutely right, Ali. I mean, that analysis makes sense to me. I think undergirding this is who we are as humans. Right? It's not these systems grow because they know how to misuse a piece of us, and that piece of us is shaped by our experience over millennia of scarcity. We have taken in trauma over millennia, and he's given us not only the experience of scarce resources and how to meet them, but the scarcity mind that we bring to the experience of resources. So those needs you talk about are met with a scarcity mind. And a scarcity mind allows only for a certain amount, for certain people to be rewarded and others to be punished, for certain people to live and others to let die. And that scarcity mind gets organized around identity. So that within a nation, it's the privileged and underprivileged, it's the worthy and unworthy. And between nations, it's the strong and the weak, it's the dependent and the not dependent, the independent. And it operates in human relations one-to-one, where we have some control over how we behave with each other. But the scarcity mind carries us into institutional life. And the institutions have carried the propositions of scarcity into how we live, into a kind of common sense. So that it makes sense in America right now that someone could be allowed to die because the drug required to help them is going to cost $350,000. That principle is unchallenged. One may be offended by it morally, but how institutions can be changed in respect to that requires a politics of inclusion, where we operate with politics for the most part of exclusion. And exclusion comes out of scarcity mind.
Yeah, and I think that ties really nicely with a theme that I would like to introduce, which is the theme of language. What kind of language we're using when we're referring to people, when we're talking about peace studies instead of war studies, and even when we use the word conflict instead of war. So this also reflects at so many levels in our society, and that it kind of fuels this invisibility that you were talking about. But before we actually go into the topic of language, maybe we would throw a second poll, still thinking about this war environment nexus. And so just to get a notion of what is the thing that concerns the most with our audience. What is it for you? Is it the environmental degradation caused by warfare that we've discussed? Is it the humanitarian impacts of conflicts and on communities, or the ethical implications of using technology in war? Once again, you can only choose one option so that we get, yeah, it's quite interesting to see the things moving. But I think this would also give us an insight on where people are or what they're feeling that and positioning themselves. And then we can kind of look into this and then move maybe into language as a refuge from violence. And that's something that we talked about. I remember, Colin, you even mentioned at some point one poem, a line, something like...
Yes. Yeah, it's a Palestinian poet. I think you're thinking of the Palestinian poet who wrote, he's facing the world, this is before the current crisis, facing the world in the Middle East, said, how do I prevent my pen from becoming a gun?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that speaks to this topic of language, and that language matters. So where do we go, like when language what happens when language empties things, right?
Can I just preface it, as people are looking at those questions, that there are wonderful writings, Tom Merton in particular, who argued that language, in fact, is our defense against violence, and that when words become empty and when they're used just to convey established principles, not principle, we revert to violence. The words have to be meaningful. When they're empty, we move to violence.
Yeah. Well, just looking at the results of the poll, so it's kind of close with the first and the second in terms of environmental degradation caused by warfare and the humanitarian impacts of conflicts and on communities, and that one was kind of the winner here. So, and then also there's some voting on the ethical implications of using technology in war. So I think it's interesting just to get an overview of where people are positioning themselves in regards to what we were discussing in a way before. I can remove this, I believe. Or did I not share the results?
That's fine, you did it. Yeah, no, I
Okay.
said.
Okay. All right. And yeah, but going a bit into this idea of language, and I think you brought that aspect already, because with these concepts also, even when we're talking, if you're talking about necropolitics or biopolitics, it all has an impact, right? So
yeah, I mean, I think this idea of language, firstly, I mean, especially living in a place like Helsinki, one is very acutely, and I think this is a great practice in a way. But because English is not the first language of many people in Helsinki, both Finns, but also people from different parts of the world, there is a certain sense of being respectful with difference,
Mm.
you know, that this understanding that, okay, if I use a word, it may not necessarily mean what you think it means. And so let's keep that openness for unpacking what do we really mean by what we're saying.
Okay.
You know? And often what happens is that within a lot of conversations and actions, that sense of openness or that space, the space to examine these nuances.
Mm.
I mean, we do not afford ourselves that space,
Mm.
or the circumstances do not afford us that kind of space.
Mm.
It's not just a desire or a want, but I think this is also maybe a kind of a dynamic difference between activism or action making, where certain things have to be simplified enough for us to then take action, you know, that yes, this is wrong and this is right, and therefore we must, you know,
Yeah,
do this.
yeah.
But these kind of conversations, especially when one is talking about such large umbrella issues of environment and war and humanitarian crisis, is both direct and structural, and historical, and its impacts in the present and how it creates futures. I mean, it already sounds so much.
Mm.
It's not that it's complicated, it's just that it's complex. So it needs time, it needs nuance, it needs a certain way in which one moves from one thing to the other.
Mhm.
And all the time, I think, especially in communication, then we need to also keep in mind that we are carrying people all together, that it's not a journey that only I'm taking,
Yeah.
but it's all of us taking that
Yeah.
journey, and whether we are all on that journey or not.
Mm.
So I think in that sense, a lot needs to be done in terms of how we talk about certain things. You know, like we've been talking about AI, for example, and I won't get into this, but I mean, just the idea that AI is understood to be this general artificial intelligence, which has a certain kind of sentience. But even if it is not, that there is a certain kind of autonomy to this agent, that it actually acts of its own accord. And we forget the human intensive work that is consistently being done on a
Put
daily
into.
basis, that actually facilitates the simulation of that autonomy, or that AI today is still only capable of doing exactly what we have told it to,
Yeah.
just that it is able to do it in a certain level of complexity that is difficult for us to follow with
Yeah.
our human limitations. So it
Mm.
seems like a certain independence
Yeah.
and autonomy.
And
So
also up to a point in time, if you think
exactly.
about it. So
So
if we tie
so-
this with like our, you know, the human experience, the memory,
exactly.
you know,
So
that can
I mean,
also.
unpacking these kind of ideas, these concepts, I think are very important through the work that we do as well.
Yeah.
And I mean, also, I mean, Colin, you're a writer, so maybe you can also talk about the idea of how language becomes so, I mean, and not just English as a language, or not just the written word, but also
Yeah, communication.
exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
we are now living in a world space that is being defined by code. We are all online. We are not in a live space, or a IRL or a AFK space. We are in an online space. So we are in a world generated by code. And so then what is the space for poetry in a world space generated by code? Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, so a number of things. I mean, I think that the language before its words is the process where experience becomes observed, reflected on, and shared. And that's a process shared both by science and art. Direct experience is the beginning. What I think of as the right-wing zeitgeist, or wherever it occurs, on the left or the right. One can be in an ideological prison at either end of the continuum. That where it occurs, it basically freezes people into the conclusion about their experience not inviting them to have their experience. And that process is colonizing in the most macro kind of way. And that requires that words be attended to for their meaning. Just to give you a couple, but without picking on things as more important than others, but I work in the world of philanthropy. And philanthropy means love of humanity and altruism, but it isn't that. Really, it's really about the management of resources made by people who have generally made it badly, that is at human cost, who continue to control it and make whimsical or ideological decisions about how to spend it. And people who come looking for the money are impoverished by it. They have to be anti-democratic, they have to accept an anti-democratic framework, even if they're pursuing democratic goals. Mm. That mismatch creates effect. It's anti-democratic. Mm-hmm. Wage theft sounds like it's naming a reality. It's actually equal opportunity slavery. Mm-hmm. It isn't just stealing wages, it's stealing life. So there are ways in which we are not precise enough about our words. And I mean precise not to create an ideological conclusion, but to open up the space. And something we talked about the other day, Ali and Ines and I, is the significance of civic space. Opening rather than allowing coercion to close civic space. There can't be a democratic experiment without civic space. Civic space is both online and offline. It's in how we greet and meet each other. It's in how we operate in politics. It's how we perforate the idea of nationality. If we freeze the idea of nationality without perforation, we have to have war.
Yeah.
So perforation is a critical grammatical variable on language. Perforation is, I like to think, is the height of generosity. That if you don't perforate, you freeze. So I think words and the meaning of words, being open about discovering the meaning of words, allowing indirect experience to inform how we understand the world before the process of observation and hermeneutics, are critical for open space. And what we're seeing right now is the shrinking of open space. There was a study done recently about, another word is development. Development aid is not about development. At the best, it's about meeting crisis and feeding people. There's very little actual development of the human and of the society the humans live in. We need to be clear about the words. There was a study recently that correlated funding with on development with the closing of civic space, because the terms of engagement are narrowed by the givers. And so that is a critical problem. Our coercive politics derives in large part, not entirely, but from who we are as people, but also how we have come to use language and to use it, as Orwell warned us, without substance, words that codify the experience you're supposed to have rather than the experience you actually have.
Yeah.
I was actually going to say, and this is maybe the perfect time to say it, but also that language is any form of language is a social contract. So we understand this to be a glass because I know it as glass and you know it as glass, and so this is a glass. So as soon as we kind of opt out of that contract, there is a disintegration of language. And that is also then, I think, to a very simple way of saying a lot of what you talked about, in a sense of it is us choosing to opt out of certain forms of social contracts through in not just in language and in communication, but also in the ways in which we structure our values and the ways in which we structure our politics, our economies, and our ways of engagement with each other. They are becoming narrowed.
Yeah.
Also, I think there was something else that I wanted to say that I really that was it kind of just, but maybe it'll come back.
Okay.
Yeah.
While you're thinking about that, it's worth pointing out, I think, that at least in the West, the centrality of the Bible, which is central in its English translation. Interesting enough, the person that actually translated it was executed for doing it, but it's now the hallowed instrument. And but that Genesis story of Adam is empowered to name the animals, and therefore have dominion over them.
Exactly. And so names
Again,
have power.
yeah,
The
names
act
and
of
like,
naming is
yeah.
also a very
Right.
colonial
Oh, yeah.
idea as well. So
Yeah.
one could look at it from that context
Yeah.
as well. The
Because it's a way of defining identities.
Exactly.
identity,
too.
exactly.
And
And
it's very
along with identity, with rights and privileges.
Yeah, and it was interesting that this came from AI in a way, like the beginning of that thread of thought. Because today, I don't know if you're familiar with the work that Ai Weiwei is doing with the questions that is asking 81 questions impossible questions to ChatGPT. And today's question, I got a screenshot of it because he asked, which is more important, knowledge or imagination? Based on the assumption of what Einstein said, that imagination was more important than knowledge. But what did the ChatGPT answer to this was, both knowledge and imagination are essential, serving different purposes. Knowledge provides a foundation for understanding reality, while imagination fuels creativity and innovation. And the interplay between the two contributes to human advancement. So it's very interesting, at least for me, that in a way, AI or ChatGPT kind of made a blend of how important these two are. And I think that would bring us to maybe, I guess, more or less final note that I would like to squeeze in here, which should be, when we think about the role of memory in continuing this need of war, and how does it work, like, because sometimes people say, okay, young people, they didn't have the experience of war, and that was going to depend a lot on where they're from, of course, so they would engage in war in an easier way. But it might be that if you're born in a context of war, that you would also engage in war because of that. So it can have kind of this dual aspect. But then my question is, if you think about activism and in relation to memory, like the memory of what has happened in the past and what is happening now, if we think about activism, not just from an anti-war activism perspective, but also from a climate activism perspective, is this going to make a difference in avoiding wars, in rejecting the war? And so what is your feeling on that?
I mean, we're seeing what has been happening in the last 5 months, and the kind of ecological toll also that it has taken. I mean, the amount of ecological toll that has taken, I mean, apart from the loss of human life and property and everything. But I mean, I think it's interesting that you picked this question that I asked and the answer that the AI has given. So AI. So I mean, this idea of imagination and knowledge actually as, again, a binary that is that's often put as being mutually exclusive of one another, is such a, like, I find it very amusing, because also this idea that, okay, we are I mean, currently today we are in a knowledge society, right? The kind of ways in which immaterial labor is prioritized, the ability to communicate, act autonomously, to produce knowledge are the requirements for being creative and for creating, for being both artist and scientist.
Yeah.
But And also with that is the idea that once knowledge is produced, it has to be transmitted, that there is a certain kind of propagation and sharing of that knowledge through whether capitalist platforms or altruistic free sharing, however, but sharing is essential to the production and continued production of knowledge. But we are increasingly seeing the way in which we are asked to form knowledges and the way in which certain forms of knowledges are being prioritized, which we can see in the whole university environments. We can see that in the ways in which certain kind of professions and vocations are prioritized, where both art and science are receiving a certain kind of a backseat, and also being there's cutting of funding and so on and so forth, where non-government or alternate funding systems actually need to step in, with Kone Foundation or also with Colin, what you've been involved with, that there is a certain kind of vocational knowledge, but also that knowledge as a kind of a knowledge in its grandeur, both scientific and artistic, is being stunted, and we will soon be in a knowledge society without knowledge.
It's
And
more
so
of
then
a production.
it's a production. But then, and then when we are then thinking about imagination with the stunted knowledge, what kind of imagination can we have? What are the kind of forms of imaginings that we will be able to afford ourselves again?
And
so
what
the
is the
question
public
of
space like?
affordance
Colin?
again comes in. Exactly.
What is
Can I
Yeah.
answer the story? Can I answer the story here?
Yes, I will
I
keep
just
on.
want to say a couple of things about riffing off of what you said, Ali. So I think it's important to recognize that to a very large extent, knowledge is imagination, right? That what we agree on as knowledge is a shared imagination. The critical variable is falsifiability, that we can actually test what we regard as knowledge if we take the time to do it, or we have the heart to do it. That's why it's possible to say, and I've forgotten who said it, but it's very poignant, I think, that we imagine the past and we remember the future. That we carry with us memories that are deep, that are quite different from the histories that we relate. And the knowledge that is deep in our memory system often shapes what we regard as acceptable fact. So shame and blame, as I said earlier, can inherited over time, can shape what are the terms of engagement in the 45 wars that are currently operating in the world, many of which are based on ethnic cleansing. Cleansing, again, look at that word. Cleansing, really? But anyway, based on a tribal superiority, superiority in the sense of more power, not superior as in better than. So we have this complex that's built on who we are and what we carry with us through the hurt and pain of our familial circumstances, our historical familial circumstances, and the production of knowledge, which takes imagination to agree on that, in fact, is knowledge. And I don't think we have clear answers to that, except open space. That movements in their best sense, progressive movements historically, have been about opening the space for understanding the limits of the knowledge that has organized society. Whether it be feudal or constitutional or parliamentary, those are limited, a nation, those are limited frameworks based on knowledge as accepted with a breakdown in imagination. And we have to open the space, the civic space, for imaginative engagement and for heart-to-heart engagement.
Yeah, I'm kind of looking at our time also, and the chat. I see a few interesting comments in the chat, and in the question and answers, there's someone that would be interested in connecting with the both of you.
Happy to connect.
Is there time? We talked about this, and it's fine not to. But
yeah, we have a little more time. I would like.
There's one short poem but on revenge, because revenge is a critical variable in this. People imagine revenge, and they think that the facts give them the right to have it. And so just a quickie, it's called Revenge is a Bloodsucker. Blood runs off my tongue like a sagging door, raging to stop swinging, and so swinging more. Blood in the tread of my boot makes the living room rug look like a body bag. Could death be the intended flaw, the craftsman's shrug? Why not mercy? If not mercy, but please mercy, then bring hope. Hope can survive under refrigeration, I'm told. Studies claim it will be as good as ever when restored. No word on who are we while it's frozen, defrosting, and thawed.
Thank you for that. Yes, there's also a comment in the chat that I think would be interesting kind of to read. And then there is one last poll that I would maybe launch, but Richard Orwell wrote that war, by becoming continuous, has ceased to exist. A current social state of mass trauma affecting our ecology of mind, quote unquote. So I think this is an interesting comment, and it also ties nicely with the idea of memory or memory versus history.
I think this speaks very acutely to this idea of the normalization.
Yeah, definitely.
That it has not ceased to exist, but it has become so normalized that we no longer see it for what it is.
Yeah.
So a previous project that I was doing that you're familiar with, Ines, and I think maybe also Colin is familiar with, called War Room Echo. And in it, a component is the Wallace Codex, which is a compilation of all conflicts from 3500 BC to the present. It's a massive document. And I mean, one of the things that becomes very clear very quickly is that there are maybe just a handful or a dozen years in which are entirely conflict free. Otherwise, there's always been a conflict at somewhere
point in history, yeah,
throughout. And so, what I would actually say is that the state of war or conflict actually is the most continuous history of human beings, apart from, say, language or music, but older than language or music also perhaps. And that we are actually engaged in a continuous planetary civil war since the last 5,400 years. And in that sense, yes, can something that never was a special moment of time exist as a special moment of time?
Yeah. It's like the normalization.
That's the paradox
also the
of
normal,
war. Yes,
in a way.
exactly.
This is the evidentiary question we don't have an answer to. The history of revolution ends by and large with a guillotine.
Exactly. Well,
Right?
Maybe we
So-
can watch the last.
If we're looking at evidence, we don't have evidence for our hope. But nevertheless, the hope has been coterminous with the war.
Exactly. And I think on that note, yes, I will launch this poll, and I think this will be reflecting on also on the topics that we'll address. So how can art science address global challenges? Is it as being a catalyst for raising awareness and fostering understanding? Is it a driver of innovative solutions and interdisciplinary collaboration, or a means of advocating for social and environmental change?
so I have to say that the archivist in me does not like single choice questions. I would say.
Yeah.
That's why I wanted to make it hard.
Yeah, the question in the chat, can we choose all? That's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, but also as an archivist, I think the whole relationship to the past
You
is
can't
the
choose.
memory.
I'm sorry, just Wednesday, you can't choose all. You need to choose one. But sorry.
No, I was just saying that as an archivist, the whole relationship to the past as memory is also such a complicated thing, because yes, there is certain ways in which we would like to think of our past as being a certain kind of, like ecologically speaking, yes, we need a return to a foreseeable past.
Yeah.
But it's such a complicated kind of a thing because very quickly that turns into nostalgia, or even worse, it turns into a certain kind of a longing or a nationalist longing for a
Yes.
certain kind of an identity.
Mm.
And again, and so like even with a project like Purgatory Edit, or hopefully with our collaboration, I think the idea of the archive is an archive for imagination. The archive as a space where, through an informed database, through an informed, through the information of knowing, that one can actually
Imagine.
facilitate an imagination
Mm.
for different kind of speculative futures.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's the role also. That's
yeah.
the hope.
And that's the hope. Exactly. That's
Kind
the
of.
hope.
And I think that with the guests that we'll be having, we'll also get a chance to see how many, like our next conversation, for example, will be going into narrative and how powerful narrative can be. And we'll have other topics that will come up and we'll announce them along the way. It's interesting. So the most voted is the driver of innovative solutions and interdisciplinary collaboration, which is kind of this, like the project Echo Effect, and we'll be also talking to other people that are also focusing on these possibilities. And so it's what we named in a way our first conversation, this idea from urgency to possibility. So there is the urgency, but we also want to have the possibility of a future. So yeah, this is interesting. Maybe we can stop sharing the.
Yeah, and I think maybe also for me the point of the conversation is to name the urgencies, but
Yeah.
also open up the space for the following following sessions
Dialogue.
that I hope all of you will join us
Yes.
in actually naming then what are the possibilities, or how do we arrive at the possibility that we are seeking right now.
Yes. And so I will remove the poll, I think. Okay. And yeah, I think the comments in the chat were kind of the things that that came through from the conversation. You're welcome to, of course, follow us on Instagram. We'll publish also like the Facebook events. We have a newsletter. So if you want to subscribe also in our website at artistswithevidence.org. So feel free to also connect with us if you would want to get a follow-up or be in contact with Ali, Colin, or if you would like to. I saw a couple of notes on collaborating also with Artists with Evidence. It will be a pleasure to talk more, and we hope to see you on our next conversation in April. We'll have another one in May, and then we'll take a short break, and then September, October, and November are the months. So yeah, just keep an eye, and thanks for joining us.
Yes, it was a pleasure. Thank you, Colin, for.
Pleasure. Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Ines. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much for the two of you.
Yes, and thank you for everyone to join.
Yes.
Thank you. It was very kind of you to bear with us.